This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we'll hear about a bill before the Connecticut General Assembly that would help veterans with other than honorable discharges access state benefits. First, today we're talking about the Iraq War. The United States invaded Iraq in March of 2003, and the war waged on for nearly 9 years until President Obama followed through on an agreement to have the U.S. military officially withdraw from the country in December 2011. But that didn't mean the war ended. Today, 5,000 U.S. troops are still in Iraq to train and support Iraqi forces, who are now currently battling ISIS in the city of Mosul.
Iraqi and coalition aircraft and artillery pummeled ISIS targets in the western part of the city.
The bombardment of western Mosul is intense and steady.
Iraqi forces have taken more villages southwest of Mosul.
That's reporting over the last week from CNN and Al Jazeera. Now, ISIS has taken control of key cities in Iraq since 2014. The dominance of the so-called caliphate grew out of the country's instability and rise of insurgents who streamed into Iraq after the U.S. invaded. Ironically, the support American troops are giving Iraqi soldiers today is what the military was doing back in 2004. Retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel Michael Zacchea knows firsthand during his year-long deployment then, his job was to train and lead the 1st Iraqi Army battalion. He details his mission in the new book, The Ragged Edge, co-written with Ted Kemp, a senior editor at CNBC. Mike joins us here in studio in Hartford, and Ted Kemp joins us by phone. Mike and Ted, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy.
Thanks a lot for having us.
So Michael Zacchea, again, retired Lieutenant Colonel of the U.S. Marine Corps, co-author of The Ragged Edge, a U.S. Marine's account of leading the Iraqi Army 5th Battalion. That's the full title. You've been on the show before. For our listeners who don't know a little bit about you, tell them about you. When did you decide to enlist in the U.S. military?
Sure. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps after my junior year in high school in 1985. So I can't believe it's more than 32 years now. But I got commissioned. I went to college. I got a scholarship. I got commissioned as a second lieutenant, and then I was a career Marine. And I had a number of deployments. I went to Somalia. I was in Haiti. I did some what are called B billets or short billets. I was on recruiting duty. And then I got recalled to go to Iraq to do this particular advisory mission at a time when no American had ever built and trained and led in combat in Iraq, in Arab military.
So this is a book a long time coming because you have spent a long time going over your time in Iraq. Now in Connecticut, you're a well-known advocate among the veterans community. You've been leading the program at UConn, the Entrepreneurship Boot Camp for Veterans with Disabilities, for some time. But why do this book?
This book came out of therapy I was doing in 2007, 2008, cognitive behavioral therapy. And you have to write down a bunch of events that happen, and then you keep going over it and keep going over it, keep going over it, and finding more details and processing it. By the time I had finished that process, I had over 300 pages of handwritten material. I showed it to a friend of mine, and he suggested that this could and should be a book, and I realized that I needed help in crafting it as a narrative, and I put up a help wanted ad on a writers forum, and a bunch of people applied, and eventually I hooked up with Ted, and Ted came aboard in late 2008.
Now, Ted is on the phone with us. He's a senior editor at CNBC. Ted, what is it about Mike's story that compelled you to answer that ad and start this collaboration?
Well, I'm a sort of an autodidact of history, and I cover geopolitics for CNBC. It's just something that's been a big interest of mine for a long time, including military issues. And when Mike approached me, we actually got together. We were having pizza in Grand Central Station the first time we met face-to-face to talk about the possibility of working together. And it became clear early on that he had a really extraordinary story to tell, because what he actually was he was a historically significant individual whose story had never been told, and he's historically significant because he was the first U.S. serviceman to try to raise a so-called sort of native military unit to fight sort of on behalf of the United States or to further U.S. goals. And that's something that no Westerner had done since Lawrence of Arabia did it, literally 100 years ago this year. And on top of that, he had such a wealth of information. He had been a meticulous journal keeper. He had written these therapeutic pages, as he was mentioning earlier, and he had a number of photographs, and there was a lot there to work with, and so I immediately accepted.
Mike, take us back to 2004. We know now there was a lot of theater that was taking place from the administration of George W. Bush. We invaded in 2003. After a few weeks, the U.S. declared victory. And at this time, you're an officer in the Marine Corps. You're given a job to do in 2004. A lot of what we now know about the war was probably not known back then, at least from you leading this unit. So take us back to that time and how you felt knowing that you were being deployed there to do this particular mission, to train the Iraqis in this new Iraqi Army.
Like many or all Americans, I had been subject to a certain amount of propaganda about the Iraqi Army, and I became a Marine officer right during the first Gulf War, and there's a lot of talk about their Soviet order of battle, and they're the fourth largest land army in the world, and they've been in 8 years of combat against the Iranians, et cetera. And that propaganda during my military career sort of continued, and everybody believed that Saddam Hussein was sort of this really bad actor. The Iraqi Army during what they call the March Up basically collapsed within a period of a few weeks. So when I got orders, there was at that time a low-level insurgency. There were some bombs. There were, people were still running around Baghdad without armed convoys or things like that. When I got there, though, it became very apparent that, especially in March of 2004, which is when the whole Fallujah thing happened, and then April when the first Battle of Fallujah happened, that there was a real insurgency that, I believe that the Department of Defense and the Bush administration were slow to identify. They specifically referred to it as a few dead-enders, a few people who, were not ready to give up the fight, and that they would eventually. But, my experience and what I saw on the ground was that this is a real intent insurgency that wanted to fight. They were not dead-enders.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today I'm speaking to the co-authors of a new book. It's called The Ragged Edge, a U.S. Marine's account of leading the Iraqi Army 5th Battalion. It's an account of the work that Michael Zacchea did, a Connecticut resident, retired lieutenant colonel of the U.S. Marine Corps. Ted Kemp helped write that book, senior editor at CNBC. I wanted to read a passage, Mike. You mentioned this insurgency. It was written here. There was a real insurgency churning in Iraq under its own power. The White House didn't call it by its name, but we on the ground knew what it was. Angry men flowing into Iraq from all over the Middle East and beyond. By the spring of '04, we were not doing a cleanup operation anymore. We were fighting an insurgency that had not existed until we sparked it.
Right, and I think that's really, really important because a lot of my combat was with non-Iraqis who had joined what was then called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was started by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He originally called it the Islamic State of Iraq, and then he pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden. It became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But none of that existed before we got there, and it started specifically in response to our presence in Iraq. And there were people coming from all over the Middle East to fight. We encountered a lot of Syrians, Libyans, Saudis, Chechens. A lot of Chechens came. And that was my experience. And their propaganda was that they wanted to fight the Crusaders and the Zionists.
Tell us about the recruits. Paul Bremer, if we remember, was the one that led the Coalition Provisional Authority. He didn't do any favors by disbanding the country's, Iraq's military after the U.S. invaded. So now you had to start from scratch. Who were the people you recruited, and what were the challenges?
So this is really fascinating, and this is really how I got to know Iraqis and know the country. And my counterpart, Zane, never forgot to remind me that these were poor farmers. And when we say poor, we have, in the United States, we have a certain idea of what, somebody from the rural America is like. But these are really like subsistence farmers, people who never had access to health care. Many people never had shoes before. And many of the concepts that we were introducing to them were completely alien to them, not just because we were Americans speaking a different language, but concepts of providing them with the gear that they needed, or the physical fitness, morning physical fitness training that we did. These were alien concepts to them. Many of them had a very rudimentary, elementary level education. Many of them were functionally illiterate. So normal ways of training that we would use in the United States, which is complemented by textbooks, et cetera, were not available to us. It was all word of mouth and training by showing.
And some of these men had been in Saddam's military.
Right.
Were these the ones that you relied on that had that military knowledge, that discipline?
So very specifically at the beginning of the Iraqi Army, they wanted to maintain a 1/3 split between Sunnis who were from Saddam's army, Shias who may or may not have had military training, and Kurds who had military background from the Peshmerga. We did not necessarily rely on the Saddam Hussein crowd of former military. We actually, just as a practical matter, we came more to rely on the Kurds in the battalion, who made up the bulk of the NCOs and were the most competent militarily.
I wanted to bring co-author Ted Kemp back into the conversation again, also senior editor at CNBC. Ted, you're a civilian. You're listening to all of these accounts, reading the journals of this U.S. Marine, Michael Zacchea. How do you translate all of that into a book that's easy to read that could appeal to other civilians?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, going into it, I didn't know the answer to that question. But it revealed itself pretty clearly that, and I think this comes through in the book, is that this is not just a military story. I mean, Mike has alluded to how you had Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, Kurds. There were Yazidis in the battalion, other smaller minorities, and then of course the Americans themselves. So we're talking about this sort of collision of several cultures, some of which had sort of pre-existing animus toward one another. And it became clear to me as we were kind of crafting this narrative that this was really a story about several different cultures trying to come together and working together for this mission, or working against each other for this mission, as was the case sometimes. And it all came down to an individual by individual basis. And that's why The Ragged Edge is really the first story ever told in any medium, nonfiction story about the Iraq War that actually includes Iraqi characters. It seems strange. That was another thing that I discovered, is just looking at what had already been done. There were very few Iraqis, or almost no Iraqis, talked about in any of these books that you could read, or movies that you would see, or television shows, you name it. And that's where there was the really interesting story was happening, was these cultural misunderstandings, cultural miscues, and this sort of discovering of each other and each other's cultures and how each other thought.
One thing I want to add to that is, and we very deliberately make sure that we use Arab names, even if we've changed some of the Arab names, for the Iraqis that we work with. Virtually 100% of the books about Iraq and Afghanistan Americanize the Iraqis and Afghans that work with Americans. There's a tendency to want to impose our American lens onto these people to make them American and make them palatable to an American audience.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that the people who have read the book, who have given us feedback, what they're saying is that the thing that really impacts readers is that's where they're really learning things. They're really learning just how fundamentally different the cultures are in the Middle East from the American expectation. Mm-hmm. They are not Westerners, and they do not wish to be. And that is a fundamental truth to understand if you're going to understand the Iraq War or the Syria War.
Before we head to break, we were talking about this collision of cultures. Mike, as you were training these Iraqi recruits, give us an example, an anecdote of just in simple training, what it was like to see that collision of cultures before you. Something as simple as PT, for instance.
Right. And there's been a lot on YouTube about Iraqis or Afghans doing jumping jacks, and, it gets a lot of laughs and things like that. And, Americans, have been acculturated to doing jumping jacks from probably kindergarten. But, these are men who, have completely different experiences of going to school and of work and of life. So, this concept of doing a jumping jack and moving multiple parts of your body in sync with everybody else is foreign to them. I don't think it's visually it might be funny, but really when you understand it, it's not necessarily. There's a lot more to it than just that. Another example is this idea about, and I wrote about this, they would leave water bottles all over the place. Not just in the military, but in the United States. I mean, you don't just leave stuff all around. But there, they have a very different culture, and I think that their culture is predicated on their physical environment. It's a desert culture, and there's basically a lack of everything. So the whole culture is based on, we can all survive in this very difficult, harsh environment. Whereas in the United States, we have a culture of plenty. So we're like, well, get your own stuff, take care of yourself. There's, it's all around you.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about a new book, The Ragged Edge, a U.S. Marine's account of leading the Iraqi Army 5th Battalion. It's written by Connecticut Marine Michael Zacchea and CNBC senior editor Ted Kemp. When we come back from a short break, we'll find out more about the hard realities of the Iraq War from the perspective of Zacchea, and we'll ask him and Ted Kemp what lessons the U.S. should take from the war as it deals with ISIS in both Iraq and Syria. You too can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Email Where We Live at WNPR.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're focusing on the Iraq War from the perspective of Iraq War veteran and Connecticut resident Michael Zacchea. Zacchea is a retired U.S. Marine Corps lieutenant colonel who has co-written a book with CNBC senior editor Ted Kemp called The Ragged Edge, a U.S. Marine's account of leading the Iraqi Army 5th Battalion. We mentioned a little earlier in the show that this book, and Ted Kemp made this point too, you really tried to humanize the Iraqis that you were working with, Michael. When you've written this book and it's coming out in April, who's the target audience? Who do you think will pick up this book and read from it?
I think that, veterans and military people with a military background will certainly be interested in reading this. I was the first, but now many thousands, maybe not tens of thousands, but certainly thousands of Americans have had experiences living and working with and advising Iraqis, and we still have American advisors on the ground supporting Iraq, fighting against ISIS right now. I think that people who are generally interested in cross-cultural kind of interactions will enjoy this. I think people are interested in foreign policy and foreign affairs will be interested in this. I think that we offer a lot to a lot of different audiences.
I want to take a quick call now. John is calling from Glastonbury. John, you're on the show.
Well, thank you for taking my call. My question is, based on their experience in dealing with Iraqis, I read a poll recently that Pew Research had put out saying that 91% of Iraqi citizens believe that Sharia law should be the law of the land. And I just wanted to get their take on how they feel Iraqi citizens assimilating to American culture, given some of the discussions that have taken place so far, and if they could weigh in on this, very charged topic regarding immigration policy.
All right, John, thank you for your two questions. Mike, you want to take that one?
I do, as a matter of fact. So I don't want to give away too much about the book. What I can tell you is that the great majority of Iraqis do not want to live in a autocratic theocracy. Yes, the majority are Muslims, and they want to live as Muslims, but they don't want to live, under an extreme ISIS regime. I helped a number of Iraqis, interpreters, come to the United States. I've helped them assimilate. One of my interpreters lives in Connecticut. I've helped him. He's now an American citizen. And, my experience is that there's been no problems with Iraqis who come to the United States assimilating into American culture.
Ted Kemp, did you also want to respond?
Just would reiterate what Mike said about the reason there were Iraqis. A big part of the reason that there were Iraqis who were willing to work with the Americans in the first place is that they very much were averse to this idea of a theocratic autocracy. Even the religious ones, and Mike's closest friend in the battalion, who's named Zane in the book, he was deeply religious, is deeply religious, I should say, but was averse to this idea of a heavy-handed sort of government, and wanted to see Iraq actually become more like the United States, where there was a more merit-driven society, a society that had equal protection for various minorities and sects and religions, and I think that was the experience that Mike had with most of the Iraqis, and these were military Iraqis, but most of the Iraqis that he was dealing with.
We've mentioned Zane a couple of times now in the hour. Tell us a little bit more about your relationship with him, Michael. I know in the book there is a scene in the beginning where you're talking about when your deployment was up and what that was like, how it took a toll on Zane.
Right. He called me brother. I called him brother. A great deal of my time, waking hours, working hours, probably up to 20 hours a day was spent with Zane, and doing the hard work of, supplying and outfitting the battalion. Again, I don't want to give away too much, but I can tell you that he saved or participated in saving my life, and eventually I was inducted into his tribe, so that if any harm came to me, it would incur a blood debt or a blood feud with his tribe.
You talk about the worry that he had that you would be harmed because you were in a very critical role training this new Iraqi Army battalion. The insurgents saw you as the enemy.
Yes, and Zacchea had written a letter that said specifically that we have to kill the Iraqi Army before it stands up. If they stand up, then democracy will come and we will lose. So because we were on the leading edge, we were very specifically targeted by Zacchea and his organization at that time. So we suffered a lot of atrocities. We were in daily contact with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they were very intent on destroying not just the battalion, but the bonds between the Americans and the Iraqis. That would have been mission failure for us.
Let's talk a little bit more about Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which many people point to being the precursor to ISIS.
Right.
So much attention now on ISIS. We started the show with a clip from the current news of the Iraqi forces there now battling ISIS to try to get them out of Mosul. When you see all of this happening now, Mike, what is your response, and were there ways to avoid what we have to deal with today?
I'm going to answer the first question first. So my response, especially when ISIS took Fallujah and subsequently when ISIS took Mosul with less than 1,000 soldiers that defeated a 20,000-man garrison in Mosul, basically the entire collapse, or the collapse of the entire Iraqi army there, very, very disillusioned, very extremely, sorely disillusioned, as were many veterans of Fallujah.
The second battle of Fallujah?
Yeah, the second battle, right.
A lot of Marines died.
Yes. A lot of Marines died. A lot of Marines were wounded. My battalion took heavy casualties as well. Obviously I was wounded there. So very, very disillusioned. But at the same time, I can't say it was necessarily unexpected. understand that there's a need for an advisory mission, and that historically there is an advisory mission in the military. But I think it's a real geopolitical mistake to predicate the success of our geopolitical objectives on an advisory mission or on the actions or motivations of a third country military.
Ted Kemp, what does the rise of ISIS today mean for the timing of this book?
Well, it's our position, and I think it's a position of a lot of political scientists, for example, that this is one war. The war that started in 2003 is the same war that we're in now, and there's very clear links between the story that takes place in the Ragged Edge and today. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who is in the Ragged Edge and who was eventually killed with the aid of the 5th Battalion, which Mike trained, he's in the book, and he is the person who founded ISIS. Mike's battalion was Mike literally trained the Iraqi soldiers who literally were killing or attempting to kill the very individuals who would later form ISIS. So there's a direct continuity there, and with the United States now potentially looking at increasing the advisory role in Syria, and with, as Mike pointed to, the successes that ISIS had in 2014, it gave us a new relevance and frankly marked an uptick in the interest that we were seeing in the book from publishers.
Right. One thing I should also mention, talking about the linkages, so we know now that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the so-called caliph of ISIS, was in American custody when I was there in 2004 and was subsequently released. And always on the radical side, he became more radicalized and joined, rose in the ranks of what was then Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and ascended to the leadership based on this. And Americans don't understand this about this caliphate, which is the Sunni-Shia divide. So Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi claims direct descent from Muhammad, and that he has the right to rule what is called the Dar al-Islam, the House of Peace, which is the land of all the believers. That is where that comes from, and Americans don't get that.
Sorry about that, Mike, but when you look on television today and you see footage of Iraqi soldiers fighting against ISIS, those are two enemies fighting each other, right? Mike Zacchea is literally the individual who was there at the very beginning of both of those lines forming. The very first secular, Iraqi rifle battalion he trained it, and they were literally trying to kill the very same individuals who would later form ISIS. So we're talking about the very genesis of everything that you see going on in the news today. That's what the Ragged Edge is about.
This country of Iraq, very diverse. There's been critics of the war looking back at Iraq and the conflict there, and the idea that the U.S. was intent on nation building, but they were in a nation that they knew very little about. Right.
I really think that we looked at Iraq, and I certainly did before I started really studying Iraq to get to know it, but as monolithic. The truth is Iraq has a long history, and many both ethnic and religious groups live there. We dealt with Zoroastrians, Yazidis, Turkmen, Chaldeans, Assyrians. All have their separate identities, their separate histories, and for many hundreds of years, centuries, they all lived in relative harmony until now. And there's basically been a de facto ethnicide or religicide partitioning of the country into three very distinct, the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurds. With and you saw an international effort to rescue the Yazidis that ISIS was intent on, completely killing. Based on their understanding of the Yazidi religion.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucine Alpathanchel. Today I'm talking to the co-authors of a new book, The Ragged Edge, a U.S. Marines account of leading the Iraqi Army 5th Battalion. Michael Zacchea is retired Lieutenant Colonel of the U.S. Marine Corps, a Connecticut resident. Also, Ted Kemp, senior editor at CNBC. He's joining us by phone today. The book is coming out shortly. We had talked about who you want to pick up this book and learn from it. Something that struck me, Michael, the foreword was written by retired Major General Paul Eaton. This was the general that you worked under the first part of your deployment. He wrote in that foreword, quote, "I don't know if we ever had any chance to succeed."
That's a pretty sobering thought, because, obviously when we went to the Green Zone, he called us to the Green Zone and he talked to us and he said, and that's where the title of the book came from. Gentlemen, we are operating at the ragged edge of our competence, and there's no assurance of success. We were, that was him telling us that we're in uncharted waters. This has never been done before, and there's no safety net. There is no rescuing if you get in trouble. And that was a very sobering moment. So for him now to say 10 years later, I don't know if we ever had a chance to exercise. I mean, I'm sure he believed at the time that we were going to be successful, but there was it's very hard to describe, and we try to describe just how, just the lack of any kind of structure or support there was when we started.
I wanted to ask you how this war shaped your life after the military. There's a passage in the book where you write, "It's impossible for me to pin down a single incident from Iraq that marked a turning point for my psychological health." That's partly because of the sheer volume of experience, which range from laughable absurdities to something akin to waking night terrors. There's also the mysterious apparatus known as our neurology and the hard physical injuries mine took. You mentioned you were injured in the Second Battle of Fallujah. What happened after?
Right. So I was, I had several injuries, but I was wounded by a rocket-propelled grenade in the Second Battle of Fallujah. RPG went off right behind my head. I came home. I subsequently had, at the time, it was undiagnosed, but eventually diagnosed with traumatic brain injury and certainly post-traumatic stress. And many years of physical rehabilitation, working through that. Obviously now I've become a very committed, very vocal and visible veterans advocate, and with connections all across the country to other veterans and other veteran organizations to help people who have suffered. Millions of Americans, millions of American families have been shattered by this war, and I think that this is the work of a generation or more to make it right. One of the things I can mention is I've recently joined the board of directors of the Brain Injury Association of Connecticut to work with veterans in Connecticut who are suffering from traumatic brain injury.
We just have a few minutes left. Ted, I wanted to get back to you because, again, you're a veteran journalist, and you took it upon yourself to help Michael Zacchea write this book after all these detailed accounts. Tell us more about that process. And again, a lot of cross-checking, looking at account. I mean, it's a lot of background that you have to do.
Yeah, there was. I mean, part of what Mike and I said, even from the outset, that we wanted to do was sort of take his memoir and kind of overlay a journalistic kind of rigor to it, and that involved a lot of research, a lot of nexus searches, and a whole lot of interviews with dozens of people, and each person would introduce me to new people, and they would introduce me to new people beyond that who were there with Mike, both Americans and Iraqis, and there was a lot of double checking. We were at a position when we were writing this, the years that we were writing it, where it was moving further back into people's history, and their memories were beginning to fade a little bit. So sometimes you run into things where there was disagreement, where one person remembered it one way and another person remembered it another way, and it just sort of it just became a process, a highly collaborative kind of process between Mike and me, where we came to the consensus on, okay, well, here's our best guess of what happened at this moment, or the motivations of this individual, and then it slowly just sort of it was like a Polaroid picture slowly coming together on the image, and that's what we came out with.
And one thing I want to add to that is that we had a lot of source material, so not just my memoir, but a lot of the notes that I took and the fitness reports for the other advisors and things like that, and then they all had their own. Many of them kept their own memoirs and their own journals and had their own notes that they took about, events and orders and things like that. So It was a lot of source material that we had to put together and make it fit together.
And a lot of documentation as well, and a lot of images. Photographs went a really long way, and we included a number of photographs in the book. And those were sometimes when you're talking to somebody about something that was so hugely important to them at the moment that it was happening, when they talk to you about it, they don't even exactly know where to begin, and you sort of have to work around them and sort of figure out, what's the big picture here, and if you just source broadly enough, you can pull that together slowly.
That's Ted Kemp, senior editor at CNBC, co-author of The Ragged Edge with Michael Zacchea. It's a U.S. Marines account of leading the Iraqi Army 5th Battalion. Before we go, Michael, I wanted to ask you, when you look at Iraq today, what do you think will happen to that country?
I really think that the country will fragment into three pieces. I think that, and I have sort of a bias here, but I believe that what's best for the United States would be to reinforce an independent Kurdistan and support the formation of a new country completely. The southern part, the Shia part, has been completely co-opted by Iran, and the Sunnis have thrown their lot in with ISIS, and I don't know how viable that is, but I don't think that the Sunni part of Iraq would be a viable separate country.
So many complexities, but if you want to learn about the Iraq War and the lessons, The Ragged Edge comes out in April. Again, a U.S. Marines account of leading the Iraqi Army 5th Battalion, co-written by Michael Zacchea and Ted Kemp. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Lucy.
Coming up, we're going to speak to another Connecticut veteran, Tom Burke. He's working with a state legislator on a bill to help veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic brain injury. We're going to find out more after the break. This is Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up Thursday, the Syrian conflict. Will it ever end? On the next Where We Live, we'll sit down with former U.S. Ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford. We'll get his take on the country's civil war and refugee crisis and discuss the future of U.S. intervention under President Trump. That's Thursday. There's a movement in recent years on the federal level to help veterans with PTSD who have bad papers, meaning the former service members receive dishonorable or other than honorable discharges. Now, this prevents them from receiving federal benefits like health care, service-connected disability payments, and assistance with education and housing costs. After the Pentagon was sued by veterans advocacy groups, it issued a memo directing the department responsible for upgrading discharges to take into account a former service member's mental health records when they look at whether to upgrade a discharge. Now, here in Connecticut, this legislative session, there's a bill to help these same veterans receive state benefits. To tell us more now, I'm joined in studio by Thomas Burke, a former U.S. Marine and a current student at Yale Divinity School, associate pastor in Westport, Connecticut. Thomas, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Lucy. It's so good to be back. And
you're here with your therapy dog, Rosie. I just wanted to give her a little shout out.
Yes, a face only for the radio.
And also on the phone is Representative Stephen Harding, who's the legislator that's working on this bill. Representative Harding, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Good morning, and I'm happy to be on.
So, Tom, I'll start with you. You're a veteran, and you were discharged after serving in Afghanistan. Tell us a little bit about your background.
So, yes, I served as an infantry Marine in both Iraq and Afghanistan. With 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, and following my service to Afghanistan, where I experienced post-traumatic stress disorder in both Iraq and Afghanistan, I self-medicated with marijuana, and because of that, and in Afghanistan, along with many of my Marines that I was in charge of, and because of that, I was given an other than honorable discharge. Part of my agreement to take the discharge was I agreed for a pretrial agreement that I would accept substance abuse rehabilitation program in exchange for this other than honorable discharge.
So you understand the impact of that after it happened, what that meant, other than honorable discharge?
Absolutely. It really, for both generations of Vietnam and post 9/11 veterans, this is a stigma where it sort of it takes away the identity of a veteran who fought in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, watched their friends die, experienced trauma, and then they're stripped of their identity of veteran, as well as the benefits that they deserve.
I mentioned that there's been movement on the federal level to help veterans with other than honorable discharges, but you're working with Representative Harding to get these veterans to also access state benefits. When we say state benefits, what are you talking about?
So yeah, Representative Harding has really been leading the way, as well as I'd like to thank Steve Kennedy from IAVA-CT and everyone at the Yale Veterans Legal Clinic who has been working so hard. And again, because of the work we've been doing on the federal level, there's been so much movement. So veterans with these other than honorable discharges have been able to receive service-connected disability, but they're still barred from state benefits, which would allow them to receive in-state tuition at community colleges in Yukon and Southern WestCon, as well as transitory programs at the Rocky Hill facility, which for occupational therapy, substance abuse rehabilitation programs. And these are the programs that really are going to help these vulnerable veterans who are at risk at suicide.
Representative Harding, why did you sign on to this bill?
Well, the reason I signed on is exactly because of Mr. Burke. You know, Tom has an amazing, incredible story of what he has done in his life, his service to our country, and then coming back into civilian life and coming accustomed to it and being a success in civilian life. And I look at this bill as really opening the door to a lot of these veterans who are in this population, who went out of their way to serve their country, who were on the battlefield, suffered injuries such as TBI and PTSD due to their battlefield combat, and then unfortunately received less than honorable discharges. It seems illogical to me that we don't open up these veteran benefits to these men and women who have suffered so much for our country. So it only made sense to me that we did what was right and offered state benefits to these individuals who made a great sacrifice for our country.
Has there been pushback for this bill?
There has been some questions, particularly from the Department of Veterans Administrations on how they're going to administer this. And I do understand those concerns, and Mr. Burke and myself and many others who are proponents of this bill are working with them to try to sort something out which makes sense. But that really is only the pushback. Everyone appreciates the cause because it's such a noble cause. It's more or less just the schematics of putting this procedurally in place.
When you mention the Department of Veterans Administration, are you talking about the State Department of Veterans Affairs?
Correct, the State Department of Veterans Administration. So when someone would apply for veteran benefits, if they have a less than honorable discharge or administrative discharge, the Department of Veterans Administration under this law would probably be the individuals examining this application. And they would be the ones determining whether or not this veteran has PTSD or TBI, and whether or not those injuries were suffered in combat, and then how those injuries related to their discharge. So those are all things that they would have to examine, and right now they're not too sure of the procedure of how that would go about.
When we look on the federal side, thousands of veterans who received other than honorable discharges were impacted. So in Connecticut, how many are we talking about, Tom?
So the numbers that we've gotten from the Yale Veterans Legal Clinic, which has had a lot of open litigation against the Pentagon to get this sort of work done, they've found that upwards of 13% of veterans since post 9/11 have experienced these less than honorable discharges. And as again I mentioned, it's not just the post 9/11 veteran. This has been an administrative way to separate veterans from the Vietnam War who also were self-medicating for PTSD before it even was part of the DSM and was something that the VA covered. So this is multi-generational as well.
You mentioned, Tom, that you struggled with substance abuse. You got this other than honorable discharge. How did that impact you? Because you also dealt with suicide.
Absolutely. I was fortunate to come back here to Connecticut, which is one of the leading states for veteran benefits. And because the VA gave me while I had an other than honorable discharge, it took a while, but I was able to receive service-connected disability, which allowed me to go to school, Sacred Heart University, and now I'm at Yale Divinity School, which gave me federal benefits. So I'm not. This piece of legislation is not for. It's not at all for me. It's for a lot of vulnerable veterans that just don't have the same opportunities that I do. And I've been extremely fortunate. So this is Connecticut's opportunity to really match the federal progress that we've made and able to protect these vulnerable veterans.
You mentioned that this bill isn't for you. I mean, you're an advocate in the state. But are there veterans out there who have received this type of discharge, whether other than honorable or dishonorable? Is there a stigma attached to that where they don't even know that they could ask for an upgrade based on their mental health records?
Absolutely, and that's one of the big part of the problems, and one of the things that Yale Veterans Legal Clinic has been doing for years for Vietnam veterans and for post 9/11 veterans is the sorts of avenues of regress that veterans have to approach this issue. It involves thousands of hours of pro bono or of counsel, And these are 19-year-old veterans, 20-year-old veterans that just don't have the financial competency to be able to afford counsel. And even when these veterans do get counsel and go to Crystal City in Virginia to go to the boards, they're still having a very low denial rate, which is one of the things that Yale Veterans Legal Clinic has been extraordinary on.
I'll go back to Representative Harding again. He represents Brookfield, Bethel, and Danbury. He signed on to this bill that would help veterans with PTSD or traumatic brain injury who've received other than honorable discharges to help them get access to state benefits. Is this something that other states have signed on to?
This is relatively unique. And so Tom mentioned just earlier that Connecticut really is one of the leading states in veteran benefits and providing for our veterans. And I think this is a great first step for the state of Connecticut. And I think that this is something, like many other things that we have in the state, where we can be the leading charge, we can set the example for the rest of the state. So it's unique, but it is not unique for Connecticut to be on the forefront of providing veteran benefits to our men and women in uniform.
Lots of bills before the General Assembly, Representative Harding. This has had a public hearing. What are the next steps?
So the next steps now will be for this bill to be raised in a committee meeting in front of the Veterans Committee to be voted on. At that point, hopefully it successfully passes. And at that point, it will go on to the House of Representatives, the full chamber. And just like every legislative process, it will be voted on in there. The Senate will then will pass to the Senate for their vote, and then hopefully the governor will sign it into law. So we're looking at a few months down the road. I think the deadline for the Veterans Committee is a little while away. It's about a few weeks away. So it will be a little while before they vote on it, and then it will be quite a while. I think the end of session is beginning of June this year. So it could be possibly by the beginning of June when hopefully this becomes law.
And have you reached out to the Commissioner of the State Department of Veterans Affairs, Sean Connolly? Any discussions of how this bill could help veterans in the state?
I have not spoken with Mr. Connolly directly, but I've spoken with many individuals in the Department of Veterans Administration and legal services there. And again, they're supportive of the cause. They appreciate the cause. They want to help. They just have some questions about procedure. And I think that will be more or less flexed out as we go further on in the legislative process. There might be some substitute language, there may be some amendments which more structurally sets a procedure for how these veterans can receive these benefits and how they apply. But I think that will be a little further down the road, and I look forward to working with the Department of Veterans Administration and Mr. Burke, as such a strong advocate that he is, to make sure that the procedure works, and most importantly, these men and women get the benefits they deserve.
That's Representative Stephen Harding, again, who represents Brookfield, Bethel, and Danbury. Thank you for joining the show today, Representative Harding.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really appreciated.
Also, Thomas Burke, former U.S. Marine student at Yale Divinity School and associate pastor in Westport, Connecticut. Thanks for coming in to tell us a little bit about your story and why this bill is important to not only you, but other veterans here in Connecticut.
Such a pleasure, Lucy. Thank you so much.
Our show is produced by Jeff Tyson and Lydia Brown. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. WNPR's executive producer is Katie Tolarski. You can learn more about the show, WNPR.org/where we live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.